Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the team at HR at 8 p.m., I welcome you all to another episode of ABCDE on a Friday evening. ABCD stands for Academia Business Consulting, Development and Entrepreneurship. This is the brainchild of Mr. Andranil Banerjee, who I will credit for doing the background work for bringing us together for this session and more to come. So sit back, thank God, it's a Friday, TGIF, sitting at home without a mask and no need to sanitize your hands. Enjoy some tasty food for the mind, and it is all complimentary. Today's topic is, what do social entrepreneurship and market-driven development really mean? The expert speaker is Ramya Venkatraman, who will be introduced shortly by our moderator, Mr. Harbhajan Singh. Harbhajan ji had come earlier as an speaker for episode 6, and his love for the show has brought him again in a new avatar as a moderator. Harbhajan ji is the Chief of Strategy and People Care, SGT University, Gurgaon. He has spent 30 years in Tata Steel and another 14 years with Honda Two-Wheelers. May I request you all to please put your mic on mute and listen. You may have seen some of the videos of earlier sessions. It takes a lot of time to edit unwarranted noise, as Zoom picks up even the slightest sound and the name of this person comes up on screen. It will be better if your name comes up to ask a question than be associated with some clink-clang in the background. You are most welcome to post your questions in the chat box. Over to you, Harbhajan ji. The floor is yours. I'll do the summing up after the speaker has spoken and the Q&A round is over.
It is my privilege and pleasure to be here as a moderator for this session. I have the pleasure of introducing Ramya Venkatraman, who is founder and CEO of Center for Teacher Accreditation Private Limited. Education has once again come in the center stage with the new education policy 2020 coming in and going in for a lot of debate in the circles. The MyCenter platform already has 150,000 teachers from 6,000 cities, towns and villages, bringing together teachers, employers and affiliated training and product companies. Center holds the status of a registered certification trademark. Ramya ji holds a BTech from IIT Delhi and is an MBA from IIM Calcutta from the 1990s. Prior to funding Center, Ramya was with McKinsey and Company for 15 plus years, including building and heading the education practice for last 5 years. In the first 10 years of her career, Ramya had worked in other industry sectors, especially manufacturing and infrastructure and several geographies, India, North America, Europe, Asia, and she continues to bring that broad professional experience to bear in her education work. Recognitions for Ramya's work in education include one of 15 awardees of Women Transforming India Awards by United Nations and Niti Aayog 2019-20. One of 50 leaders who can revive India's education by Education Void 2020. One of 26 national awardees of Economic Times Women Ahead 2019 for women leaders having significant impact on business, economic development and society. Selected as Ashoka Fellow 2016 and researched by professor from the Institute of Education UK and profiled in Peabody Journal of Education in the US as an example of how the network impact catalyzed by an individual can drive system level impact. She also has Global Entrepreneurship Award in McKinsey for her contributions to education in India 2014, only contributor from India to World Class, published by Routledge Education 2017. She is one of the 2 people from India invited into UNESCO's International Teachers Task Force Consulting Group 2019. Distinguished Alumni Award from her high school, profiled and quoted by various media from time to time, several recognitions for Center as an organization, including top 60 social enterprise in Asia, knowledge partner to Niti Aayog, member of Global Alliance on Teachers alongside Harvard University, NIE, Singapore and others. Ramya has been part of significant councils and initiatives at the global and national level. For example, member of CII Education Council 2020, member of UNESCO's International Teachers Task Force Consulting Group 2019, a member of Global Alliance on Teachers that brought out a global white paper on teacher professional development needs 2017, member of GEMS Group Global Academic Council 2016-18, member of FICCI's School Education Committee in India 2014-17, contributor to McKinsey's seminal global publication on school systems and employment. She is a regular speaker in several conferences and informal guide to some young organizations. I think we have the person who really knows education in and out, and it is a real privilege to have you here, Ramya ji. Very illustrious career, and we are very privileged to have you here. And at this point of time, when education is at the center stage of the nation, I think that you will definitely enlighten all of us, and over to you to take the session forward.
Thank you very much, Harbhajan ji. I think yeah, it's always difficult to start a session after a long introduction like that, because then, you know, people are starting with expectations which may or may not be met. But on that note, since I mean we are a relatively small group, so let me actually ask all of you, even though we'll have a Q&A later, given that you know, you have come for this topic, which is what do social entrepreneurship and market-driven development really mean? Are there some top of mind questions or themes that you would like this session to cover? And if so, maybe we can get a quick round of you know, questions or comments on the chat, and I will try to I mean, I have broadly prepared what I'm going to say, but I will try to orient it according to what you know, all of you might prefer, if there are some quick comments.
Ramya, I just I mean, just taking the lead on this, would be interested in how things change for you for Center in terms of whatever you're doing earlier and what you're going to do now with respect to the new education policy. We're still trying to understand the ramifications of the new education policy. We've read a number of documents, but what is it that is really changing? And in your view, where you are running a business out of Center, how will things change for you?
Sure. And I think Harbhajan ji has also asked, you know, how do I look upon the NEP? So we'll definitely try to touch upon that, and whether things will change on the ground. I think Agni has asked about some case studies on social enterprise, or social entrepreneurship. And we have a question from Iman Ghosh on any thoughts on reducing the linkage between reducing poverty and accelerating economic growth. Of course, big topic. I don't think I will do enough justice to that, Imanji, but I'll try to, you know, sort of touch upon it. And Indranil has asked about opportunities for HR in social sectors, and I'll try to see if there is something that I can build in on that one. And clearly the new education policy is one of the things of interest. So social enterprise is a very misused term these days, and therefore I wanted to spend a little bit of time in the beginning on what is a social enterprise, and then I wanted to cover two other things, which is why market-driven development. So what is the importance of market-driven development? And finally, what does it take to have a powerful social enterprise? And when I talk about the importance of market-driven development, I'll also switch a little bit to the policy side in education and NEP, which is of interest to a lot of people here. So coming to what do you mean by a social enterprise, or what is a social enterprise? The simplest, or what I would call simplistic definition that one hears is, if you are a for-profit company trying to solve a social problem, you are a social enterprise. And this definition lends itself to the natural question, what is a social problem? And a common answer to that will be, it is a problem in education or health or agriculture or other such areas which are called social sectors, which are also traditionally the sectors that non-profits work in. And the counter argument then becomes, isn't something like steel or power or mobile telephony or even entertainment equally required for society. And therefore, so long as you're not antisocial, you're serving a societal need. And the phrase social enterprise then starts becoming redundant when you go with this somewhat simplistic definition. So the second and increasingly more common definition that one hears is, if you're a for-profit company willing to take lower returns for the sake of social impact or solving a social problem or for a low-income segment, you are a social enterprise. Now, this is a more complex definition. It also has the additional question of, what does lower return mean? Lower than what? Because returns vary widely across businesses, and saying that one business has lower returns than the other, even within the same sector or subsector, doesn't mean much and doesn't necessarily make the business which is having lower returns to be a social enterprise. I mean, that would be like calling yourself a non-profit because you were not able to achieve profit. So the more refined version of this definition, which you also see a lot of sophisticated sort of entrepreneurs and investors using, is lower returns than what I could have achieved with the same model without having a social focus. And a common way in which this manifests on the ground is, instead of a high-priced version of a product or service that can serve only a small part of the population, I provide a much lower priced version of the product or service, which can serve a much larger and typically lower income population. And I'm not necessarily maximizing the price into volume equation. There is some merit to this definition. In fact, maybe there is a lot of merit to this definition. And there is a group of investors who would say, we will take lower returns for the purpose of social impact. But personally, I find this definition also to be somewhat limiting and not allowing the potential of the social enterprise to be fully realized. And many of us who consider ourselves to be social entrepreneurs have probably gone through these various definitions in our own heads, and as our businesses have evolved, and arrived at our own views on what a social enterprise is. So, and I'm just going to share my screen. Yeah, can you see my screen? Maybe somebody can give a thumbs up. Yeah, great. Okay, so as I said, I went through these three possible definitions: for-profit company solving a social problem, or company willing to take lower returns, or a slightly more sophisticated definition, which is social focus, even if it is not maximizing your price into volume equation. Now, the definition that I personally prefer is a two-pronged definition. One which is based on founder intent, which is of course very difficult to measure, and most of the important things in the world are very difficult to measure. So, did you start your business to solve a problem, or did you start your business to capture an opportunity? And there is nothing wrong with either. So businesses start for both purposes, but it is only the former that can be called a social enterprise. Whereas in general, yes, businesses need to capture opportunities, but only if you've started it with the explicit purpose of solving a problem rather than capturing an opportunity, it could be called a social enterprise. The second comes to the business model itself. And again, we commonly say that in a social enterprise, financial or business growth and social impact can happen together, which is okay. But the definition that I would find more powerful is that financial or business success and social impact cannot happen without each other. So that is the two-pronged definition that I want to propose. I don't have a lot of slides, so I will just share my screen every now and then, when I'm illustrating something. So that's what I want to propose as a possible definition. And why I like this particular definition is that I find both of these, that is the founder intent to solve a problem and a business model where success and impact cannot happen without each other, to be powerful forces rather than being constraints or trade-offs or limitations, which are often, some of the words you hear, talking about social enterprises. So I would like the social enterprise to be a force rather than something which is constrained by its own definition. So with that, and I'll come back to a few examples as Ms. Avani asked, and we'll talk about that shortly. So with that definition, and let me move to the second part of what I wanted to cover, which is the problem itself, and asking, why do we even need market-driven development? And of course, before and actually, let me just pause there for a minute and check the chat. Yeah, and I'm glad I checked, because I think Sujoy Datta has made a very relevant comment here that, there are a bunch of organizations which have fantastic videos for explaining various concepts. Would we consider them to be social enterprises just because they're in education? Not necessarily. Of course, I don't think that is Sujoy's point. His point is about how do you embed these in the schools, and maybe we'll come back to that a little bit later. Why market-driven development, and do we need it? And I will say upfront that as someone who's pursuing market-driven development through Centa Private Limited, I'm of course completely biased over here. But jokes apart, I mean, I've worked in education now for about 10 or maybe 10 and a half years out of 21 years of my career so far. So this year, my time in the education sector has crossed my time before the education sector. And in the last 10, 11 years, I have often observed that in the so-called social sectors, or when we talk about large societal problems, the concerned initiatives often tend to be top-down. That is, the initiatives are decided as a mandate, they are pushed through with orders from the top person of a large organization or a senior government official, through policy changes, through donor funds, through large project teams on the ground. And there is nothing wrong with this. In fact, when it is implemented well, this approach can yield dramatic change in a relatively short period of time. So for example, through this kind of approach, as a country, talking about education, we have been able to build a primary school within 1 kilometer of most habitations in a big country like ours. There are specific regions where we have been able to ensure that every school gets a separate girls' toilet, or every classroom gets a technology resource in a time-bound manner. There are large private school groups which use this kind of monitoring to make sure that every teacher reaches his or her classroom on time. And all of these are big achievements, which one should not underestimate at all. And that's where the power of the top-down, non-market-driven approach becomes very visible. But certain kinds of social change don't get driven very well by this top-down approach. And the most common among these is what I think of as qualitative improvement in outcomes delivered by a system. So when you want to improve the quality outcomes delivered by a system, even with all the technology that is available to us today across sectors, not just education, across sectors, human behavior and competency change still play a role. And human behavior and competency change take time. They require individual motivation and intention, which are typically very hard to measure. So the monitoring and tracking, which a top-down approach necessarily depends on, becomes very costly and also becomes artificial. So for example, if we want an education system to deliver high quality student learning, for example, teacher competencies are naturally central to achieving this. Now, in a top-down approach, instead of counting how many schools have smart boards, I mean, which itself, by the way, is not easy to count in a country of our size, complexity, and various dynamics. but still it is countable. You now need to count how many teachers actively engage all their students in the classroom. And this task is so complex, it is pretty much impossible. So we then resort to artificial measures like keeping track of how many teachers attended a training program on student engagement, which doesn't tell us much, which cannot tell us much. And this is the kind of qualitative outcome or qualitative change where, in my mind, the market comes in. And roughly speaking, I define market-driven change as one where it is in the best interest of each individual or entity to operate differently. And to make this work, the change needs to lead to automatic mutual rewards or incentives for each individual and each entity involved. And the rewards themselves have to come from the market, which is a collection of all the individuals and entities rather than from any specific entity. So, going back to Avni's point about case studies, when you look at say a Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, which is of course one of the most classic examples, it drives behavior change among poor women towards entrepreneurship rather than dependence by making the loan model fully aligned with their self-interest. So again, self-interest driving the change. So, when you look at, I was talking about, TerraCycle in the US. It drives behavior change towards recycling by taking on things that consumers find difficult to throw or recycle, rather than preaching that you should recycle. So self-interest becomes a very important idea behind market-driven change, and therefore also behind social enterprises. And this idea of incentive or reward is also core to what we do as Centa, which I will get into a little bit to explain the thought process behind market-driven change. So Centa is 5 years old, but in the 5 years before that also, I was working in education, as I said. And what I found working in education is that, like most people in this sector understood, teachers play the most important role towards the quality of student learning. And to improve student learning, you need to improve teaching in the classroom. Now that made a whole lot of initiatives, whether by governments, private companies, non-profits, to start pushing various things onto the classroom and the teacher. So whether it was training, technology, content, pedagogy, etc., we started pushing a whole lot of things into the classroom. And on the ground, I started finding that very few of these initiatives were really able to drive change at a reasonable scale in a sustained manner. And I started asking, why is this happening? And some of these are very, very good programs which should be used in the classroom. So why is that happening? And I also want to go back to Sujoy's comment over here, which is that there are a whole lot of technologies today that are explaining various concepts in a very simple manner, but they are not part of the mainstream. And how do they get embedded into the school system? And I started finding that on the ground that, yes, whether it's training, whether it's technology products like this, whether it is, other kinds of content, whatever, they struggle to get embedded. And when I started digging into why that's happening, I found on the ground more and more teachers asking, so what is in it for me? And why should I put in all these efforts and change my competencies, my practice, when the guy next door does not do any of this and still gets exactly the same salary, same career growth, same reward, etc. And no one even comes to give me a pat on the back. I mean, forget career growth and financial rewards. Nobody even gives me a pat on the back for doing something better or differently. And as a society, our answer to teachers has been, it's a noble profession, you're doing it for the good of the country and your children are benefiting, and all that is true, and all that obviously is the core of teaching. But like any professional, the teacher expects that when I do a good job, then I should be rewarded. And it is that linkage between competency and reward that starts driving the cycle for me to improve. And which is when we said, we need a mechanism where the market, which can be private schools, government systems, online teaching portals, individual parents, whatever, but the market starts rewarding teachers for their competencies and therefore creates motivation for them to improve their competencies. And here I'm going to once again, just share a slide very quickly. The example of CENTA as a market-driven development initiative. So CENTA is a market-driven certification which assesses, certifies, and connects teachers to opportunities. So today we work with more than 1.5 lakh teachers who come from more than 6,000 cities, towns, villages across India. And these teachers then, because of their certificate, get a range of career opportunities. So there are more than 1,000 private schools, more than 15 state governments, which value these scores and certificates in various ways. So people get placements, salary differential, role changes or promotions, international jobs, reward, recognition, supplemental income, but all the things that you want from the material world as a profession. Obviously, it doesn't take away the non-material rewards of satisfaction, of contribution to society, all of that. But we are talking about tangible opportunities, tangible self-interest and rewards over here. Now, these opportunities make teachers improve their competencies. And this in turn creates demand for a whole range of the kind of products that Sujoy mentioned. So very interestingly, now that we are 5 years old, in the last couple of years, we have actually started seeing this cycle playing out, where on our MyCENTA platform, teachers, of course, get certified, they get connected to opportunities. But there are also a whole lot of technology products certified by us, which teachers take up because they support them either in their own development or in their practice. And this then starts becoming like a virtuous cycle that can lead to what we eventually want, that is fundamental sustained improvement in the quality of education. Which brings me to what I mentioned about market-driven development is most powerful for qualitative improvement in outcomes, which typically involve human competencies and therefore require individual motivation. So that was a quick example. And with that, let me digress from the market-driven development, not exactly digress, but let me get into the national education policy a little bit, since it's of great interest and since people expect me to talk about it in most of the gatherings nowadays. So when you look at the national education policy, and I'm seeing a couple of more questions on the chat, but I'll come back to those. But when you look at the National Education Policy 2020, my view is that there are many positive things about the policy, and you hear a lot of the buzzwords in media, whether it is around critical thinking or scientific temperament or interdisciplinary linkage, having choice for students, etc., etc. So you see many of these things being talked about in media, and yes, all that is there in the policy. It's very clearly a stated intent, but all of this was also there. For example, maybe not exactly all, but a lot of this was also there in NCF 2005, for example. So the National Curricular Framework 2005 also talks about many of these things. And we are in 2020 now, which is 15 years down the line. So what is different about NEP 2020? I personally feel that there are 3 powerful drivers which make NEP 2020 more implementable. And that is one of the big comments that quite a few people on the chat have made, which is, what will be the degree of implementation on the ground. And Vimy Soki has indirectly talked about it. Avani has mentioned it explicitly. So there are a bunch of people questioning what will be the degree of implementation. So while it is difficult to predict, what makes me hopeful is that there are three big things in NEP 2020 which are fundamental changes. One is that the board exams are hopefully going to change. And ultimately, whatever you might say about critical thinking, scientific temperament, conceptual learning, etc., all of that will happen if the exam is also oriented towards that. And otherwise, all this remains outside the mainstream. So it becomes part of the mainstream when the main exam, not just the IIT JEE type, but the main exam also starts looking for these things. So that's point number one. Point number two is this whole idea of flexible paths, at least starting from the secondary and senior secondary level and going into higher education, and the ability to earn credits over time and in a range of disciplines and be able to add them together. That again can be a fundamental game changer in terms of how senior secondary and higher education may run, and particularly for students who have alternative interests, for students who have family circumstances but don't want to entirely drop out. So there are a whole lot of cases where this can be a powerful mechanism. The third, and here I'll come back to Atul's question on CENTA. The third powerful thing about NEP is that it is very explicit about linking teaching careers to competencies. So NEP is very clear that teacher promotions should happen based on competencies. It actively encourages state governments to take on such, this kind of career growth, and of course encourages the private sector to do that. It actively talks about teacher professional development being driven by teachers themselves because of these kinds of opportunities. So Atul, to your question, frankly, for CENTA, NEP 2020 is fully aligned on the teachers front with everything that we stand for and everything we are trying to do. So to give you an example, Niti Aayog took CENTA to all the different state governments and made us present our model and encouraged state governments to look at it. And coming out of that, Andhra Pradesh government formally adopted CENTA for a bunch of its important internal promotions. And some of the other states have been talking to us. Now, NEP 2020 gives state governments that explicit, not only leeway, but push to start adopting these kinds of models. I'm not just talking about CENTA, but career growth based on competencies. And this again, I see as a very fundamental lever. So personally, I feel that these are three fundamental implementation levers. And because of that, I have more hope on what will come out of this policy compared to, various changes that toward in the same direction. And at the same time, I also see it as a normal progress of an education system. So 25 years back, it was important to focus on access and enrollment. After that, in the last 10-15 years, it was important to experiment on various kinds of quality improvement initiatives. And now the time has probably come to drive some of these big game-changing moves. So I see it also as a natural evolution of an education system. And we are not the only education system which has gone through this evolution. So finally, last couple of minutes for me, and I just want to go back to the topic, given which is on social entrepreneurship and market-driven development. And the third thing I was supposed to cover was what does it take to build a high-quality, powerful social enterprise or a market-driven model of development. And frankly, I mean, I'm only 5 years into doing this, even though I feel like I've been thinking about it for 20 years. So I don't want to suggest that I know what it takes, but I'll just offer a few thoughts based on my own learnings over the last 5 years. And again, to structure it, I'll share one last slide. So here are my what I think of as the top 5 learnings. One, no value judgment. So if you are wanting to pursue a market-driven model, you need to respect the market, which means that if I value financial reward and he or she values service, there is no distinction. What we need to figure out is how to create the opportunity for financial reward in one case and the opportunity for service in the other. It's the market voting with its feet. So that's an important one for me. Second, partnerships towards building the business need to work on their own strength, irrespective of the problem you're trying to solve. And what I mean by this is that all the partners you're working with may not, be committed to the same problem, which is completely fine. But as long as your business model is such that it can cater to the interests of different partners, obviously in an ethical manner, and contribute to your mission, that's fine. So for example, I mean, certification is a very chicken and egg thing. And therefore, when we got started, the first question was, how do you get a jump start? And how do you grow to 1.5 lakh teachers in a short period of time? And we therefore did not start with certification. We started with a national competition for teachers called CENTA Teaching Professionals Olympiad, which is now actually an international competition. And because of that competition format, we had some very powerful partner organizations, whether it was the Hindu Media Group or Oxford University Press, Reliance Foundation, etc., who came on board to give prizes to teachers, to support the marketing, etc. And each organization has its own reasons in terms of why they want to reach teachers, whether it is due to a business interest or due to a philanthropic interest, and that's fine, as long as the partnership works on its own strength and contributes to your mission as a social enterprise. It's important to develop the partnerships in that manner. The third and big learning is the balance between continued focus on solving the problem versus capturing some of the side opportunities on the way. And this is a very natural and practical challenge that every entrepreneur faces, because you have to run the company, you have to pay the salaries, and there are certain opportunities that come along which don't seem to be exactly aligned with what you're trying to do. Should you digress and do those things, or should you just stay focused? And there is no right answer on this, but my only learning is to be conscious of it either way. And the even bigger related learning is that the business model has to be truly synergistic. So if you are saying that I'm going to subsidize my social impact from some other business, then it's not a social enterprise in my view. It's a company and an NGO operating together. For me, coming back to the beginning, it's a social enterprise when business success and social impact cannot happen without each other. And if you're able to, either in the beginning or over the first few years, arrive at a business model that can truly do that, so that can truly deliver social impact and can deliver full returns to investors. So not lower returns, not only certain types of investors, but full return to investors, then the social enterprise can be truly powerful. And finally, of course, last point which I just wanted to make is to avoid what I think of as limiting definitions. So using definitions which work for you as an entrepreneur, and not getting limited by how anyone else might be defining a social enterprise.
This new NEP has merged UGC and AITC, and there are several major changes which are being proposed, and especially for the private institutions which had mushroomed a lot, means they will have to go for many accreditations in the days to come to show their competency to survive. So how do you think, how will they be able to manage? Because if we take a snapshot at this point of time, all these private institutions have a good number of students, though they may be defaulting on some of the parameters which are there, and we keep on coming across that the students have reached to a situation where the examination is being conducted by, their affiliated colleges. So they run the system, but the examination is being held by some other institution. And now what is happening is that you cannot continue anymore as an affiliated college. Either you will have to become a constituent or you will have to close down. So how do you foresee the turbulence which is likely to take place to go through this process of change? How do you think that it will have an impact on the overall education system?
So Harbhajan ji, there is no easy answer to this, because ultimately big social change causes turbulence. So I think that is a given. And when we fought for freedom, we as in, obviously, none of us were there, but when we fought for freedom, that was turbulence. So in that sense, any big social change causes turbulence. And yes, there is a set of people who therefore come under pressure with that turbulence. That is a price that society pays. And I don't think there is any way to really avoid that entirely. But I hope that when the implementation of this new policy starts, then there will be some realistic transition measures so that the turbulence is minimized. I mean, it cannot be avoided, but we try to minimize it as much as we can. So to give you a simple example, because I really find Andhra Pradesh government's example very powerful in this regard, and this also goes back to Mr. Arijit Chandra's question on accountability of government teachers and whether the NEP talks about that. So when Andhra Pradesh government decided to work with CENTA, they did not tell all the 7 lakh teachers that now you need to go through a test, or tell all the incoming teachers that now we are going to change your criteria, because that would have been too much turbulence. So what they instead said is they chose 3,500 specific positions which they thought of as the positions that impact quality in the state, like diet faculty, SCRT faculty, textbook writers, people in the technology cell, etc. And they said that for these 3,500 positions, you can get promoted through a test by CENTA. And if you want to participate in that test, you apply voluntarily. And they did a lot of marketing campaign around that through the state. The government will pay for it, but you participate voluntarily. And some 15,000 teachers applied, 3,500 got selected. Now, I thought this was an interesting way of how you start the change with less turbulence and then gradually extend the same philosophy to more and more roles over time. And to Mr. Arijit Chandra's question, NEP actually, in fact, almost mandates. I mean, and we don't know whether it's going to play out as a mandate or a guideline. We'll see, because education is not a central subject. But it almost mandates state governments to use, to do career growth of teachers in a competency-driven manner, which is the attempt to drive accountability among teachers. Now, again, how it will play out, what will happen, we'll all see. But there is an explicit attempt to do that.
Ramya, I was just thinking, I think education is one area which touches everybody's life. There is no parent in the world who does not strive to get the best education for their children. Even if they have to sacrifice their own needs, they try to deliver the best. But what I find means is that the mushrooming of the private colleges. See, at one stage, we thought that the public institutions or the government schools, many of them are not doing justice to education. So we gave a lot of, push for the private institutions to come. And I will not say that many of them are not doing a great job. But at the same time, there are many private institutions also which have failed the expectations of the parents and have not delivered what they should have delivered. And now with this change in the policy coming in and trying to make teachers more accountable, teaching is a matter of passion. Means the teachers who are passionate about teaching, they make a wonderful difference in the lives of the people. And they are the great role models and remain role models throughout their life. But accountability is something which cannot be, sort of pushed down the throat. And I really don't know what ecosystem can emerge which will make the people accountable. Because that is one aspect which I find missing everywhere. In corporate world, in social life, in political life, accountability is something which I find that people just take responsibilities, but they don't remain accountable to the role that they are actually handling.
Yeah, Harbhajan ji, I think, multiple questions in what you said. But maybe I'll just, finish commenting on Rajiv ji's question on this, the 10+2, whatever, the 5+4 different models and why bind it in numbers. And I'll quickly sort of come back to what you said. So, Rajiv ji, and my personal view is that, and at least what I've seen on the ground, is that for quote unquote privileged children, which is what all of us in this call and all our children are, all that kind of complete flexibility is all fine, because one way or the other their parents will make sure that they reach a certain level in their education, in their lives. But for low-income children, which is what majority of the country is, the structure does play a certain role in making sure that some milestones are reached which are valued later in life. So at some point later in life, when you apply to become an office assistant and you have an 8th pass or a 10th pass, it makes a difference. And that's where, I feel that it's very difficult for our country to completely do away with the structure. I appreciate the certain level of flexibility that the NEP is trying to bring in, which I think is needed. And I hope that, with that balance, we will be able to move forward. And coming to Harbhajan ji's question, and you had two parts. There was a point about private people, private entities, and there was a point about teachers, and Imon Ghosh ji also has a point about in-service training of teachers. So on the private sector, Harbhajan ji, if we were sitting in 1947, I think it's a different matter on what the view should be. Should education be a public thing, private thing, etc., etc. Frankly, in today's environment, I find that there is no point in even discussing that. The private sector is a reality of our education system. And therefore, what I would want to do as a person sort of trying to contribute to reform is to say, how can we make the public system also work well? And how can we make the private system also work well? And on the private side, the more the freedom the private system can get, and the more the market can drive its accountability, I feel we will have many more genuine players entering that space. And which brings me to your point about teacher accountability also. So the point is that, teacher accountability is difficult. It has always been a tricky subject in most countries. And which is why at least my personal hypothesis and also our organizational hypothesis as CENTA has been that the market has to play a role here. So this cannot be just a top-down thing, and then you sort of end up just making people uncomfortable, union activity, etc., etc. The market has to play a role here, and has to play a role in a positive manner. So instead of thinking about it as accountability, how do we think about it as rewards and incentives for people who are doing a good job? And yes, passion has to be there in every profession, not only in teaching, but in every profession. But at the same time, as a professional, it's natural in today's world that I also expect rewards along with that passion. And that's where, the rewards can drive accountability in a very positive sense. And coming back to Imonji's point about in-service training, I think interestingly, that's precisely where my journey started. So I was doing a lot of work on in-service training of teachers, and I found that nobody wants in-service training. So there is a whole lot of supply, but no demand, to use an economic language. And in the process, the initiative doesn't sustain. And that's where, when you try to understand why they don't want in-service training, it comes back to Harbhajan's point about accountability. That if my training leads to competencies, which in turn leads to rewards, then I'm happy to take training. Otherwise, I'll come for the training and eat samosa chai because I'm compelled to do that, but you can't compel me to listen. So that's the primary observation, which in fact led to the whole series of analysis and then sent up.
There are 5,700 schools in Delhi, if I talk of school education, of which 27% are with Delhi government and 43% are with private bodies and 20% are with central government. So just to substantiate your point that, private education system is a reality which cannot be wished off even by the political system now. And the only thing is that what I find is that too much regulatory framework, scuffles the spirit of many organizations. So those who will not be befitting to the quality parameters or expectations, they will fizzle out over a period of time. But trying to control everything in terms of fees, because those who can afford are the only ones who are going there. So I think that we should leave it to the individual organizations and the market system to evolve and deliver its own quality. That was just a viewpoint that I wanted to share, ma'am.
And fully agree with you. I fully share that view and fully agree with you. And maybe to take, I think there are two questions at least that I haven't taken from Utpalji and Devanjanji. And other than that, I also just want to mention that there is some very interesting commentary from Iman Ghosh and a couple of others on the chat, which I think everyone would benefit from reading at some point. But to Utpalji's question, which is, do you think the present system of JEE, where parents don't know when one should start preparing, what is the syllabus, is this not paving the way for making sort of business for coaching centers? I think that has been a controversy for a while now. And ultimately, I think whether we talk about the IIT JEE, which incidentally, I mean, it's a very small part of the system. I think those of us who are from IIT, we grow up thinking that, that's a big thing. But we realize later in life that it's actually a very small part of our overall, ecosystem. Whereas if you take the board exam, it's a big part of our ecosystem. Everyone goes through it. So whether you take the IIT JEE or you take the board exam, ultimately an exam drives a positive outcome in the ecosystem by being of a certain quality standard in terms of what it is trying to test. And when I say quality standard, it includes, clarity on the competencies that you're going to test, clarity on how you're going to test it, and focusing more on conceptual understanding, etc., etc. And in the case of the board exam, of course, we all know the challenges, which is one of the things that NEP is trying to explicitly address. But even in the case of the IIT JEE, while I have not done any specific analysis myself, I have read analysis about how the exam pattern is significantly different from what it was in the 90s. So personally, I think that if the exam is able to maintain the focus on conceptual understanding, application, etc., whichever exam it is, then the ecosystem is driven in a very positive manner. There is nothing wrong with a coaching center, but ultimately the coaching center which should benefit should also be one which drives quality improvement and not one that drives rote learning. And for example, a lot of our boards end up benefiting coaching centers that drive rote learning, which then doesn't help the overall ecosystem. So ultimately the exam plays the most important role in driving all of this. And more than the JEE, I'm hoping that the board exams will really get impacted by the NEP. And coming to Devanjan's question, where there is an NGO that Devanjan is running, trying to improve learning outcomes of children and supporting it out of self funds, etc. And that's a fantastic initiative, and congratulations on that. While I don't have sort of detailed input at this point, but one quick thing I would suggest is that it may be quite interesting for you to connect with an organization called Education Alliance based in Delhi, which works on public-private partnerships between various organizations and the government. And personally, I was involved in the early days of Education Alliance. And what public-private partnerships try to do is to see how initiatives like this can be scaled up based on broader government support. Because if you are trying to work in government schools, then ultimately that broader support is needed. Otherwise, it sort of remains on the fringe. And I think Yvonne is commenting on, do you have any view on the success of charter schools in the US, which is, of course, the commonly quoted example of public-private partnership? The point is that relative to a lot of other public-private partnership systems in education, the chartered schools in the US have had some pretty good success. And again, there is a huge variability state to state because every state has its own policies on charter. But some of the states in the US have had very positive outcomes, mainly because of providing flexibility to the charter schools on how to operate and holding them only to outcomes and not to inputs. And I think those are the two big things to make public-private partnerships work, which some of the states in the US have been able to do.
Thank you, Ramya. Thank you. I will have to stop here. So over to Atul, and thereafter Rajiv will propose the vote of thanks.
Thanks, Harbhajanji, and thanks, Ramya. Very enlightening discussion for me too. Social enterprise, I mean, I have had the good feel of a definition, but never had a definition. And very nice to hear that you are talking about founder intent to capture an opportunity or to solve a problem, and how that can lead to a social enterprise or a business enterprise, if I say. Now, why do we need a market-led development? I think the examples that you took out were very important, especially for our education sector. And the top-down approach can lead to an impact in the primary school, as you mentioned about, in the girls' toilet. But then with the top-down approach, there are limitations. And you have rightly said the market-led development should be the norm to go ahead. Now, human behavior and competency change, and later on you talked about Grameen Bank and TerraCycle for recycling. I think those are very important examples and case studies, and people should have a look at it in greater detail, where you can, rather than preach, you can make people embrace the change in behavior. And that Grameen Bank is something that's talked about every now and then. No one gives a pat on the back for these teachers. We have all felt it. All our teachers, they still love us. I mean, many of them are no longer there. But it seems that they have only worked to make us reach where we are, but they themselves have not improved a lot. And it's a bit of a pity like that. But I think they need a pat on the back plus financial return. And that's the point you were making. I appreciate that. And the NEP, the three powerful drivers, thanks for outlining them. The board exams will change, oriented to critical thinking and some of the new concepts that have come out in this new policy. Flexible paths, a very powerful example. And that actually gives me a lot of hope, because I have been professing this when I was in NSTC. I mean, taking my personal example, I did my BTech, and at that time, which was a 5-year BTech, and the third year I lost my mother. Now, I had this fear in me that in case I don't complete that 5 years of my IIT education, I'll be going back to class 12. I mean, that's the only certificate I had, and basically good for nothing. And there were times I was down in the dumps for some time, and my exams were at the end of that, within 20 days of this particular tragic event happening in my life. If I had failed, I would be out. So, but if I were to analyze my mechanical engineering degree in BTech across the 5 years, if I were to say at the end of first year, I had become a machinist. The next year, I become a CNC machinist. Third year, I become a machine designer. Fourth year, I become a robotics engineer. And the fifth year, I get my BTech degree. At any point in time, especially let's say after the third year, when this tragic event happened in my life, if I'd come out saying machine designer from IIT Kanpur, it has a lot of value for people. But unfortunately, it was like, if I don't complete the fifth year, it's like very much like Kaun Banega Crorepati. If you don't answer that 1 crore wala question, you fall back to 12,500 rupees. So it says, I'm happy to see that kind of a change come in the new education policy. And that should sort out a number of people. And nobody talks about, when did you do your BTech in 5 years? Or did you do it in 7 years? How does it matter? I could have gotten out in third year, get my personal finances and my personal situation sorted out, come back, did the fourth year, then go out, maybe do a job, come back and do the fifth year. So that is a very welcome change, I think, in the new education policy. And then the third point was about explicit about teacher careers linked to competency. And I'm glad that Niti Aayog has taken the center example around, and you already working with the MP government, and you talked about the Andhra Pradesh government, how they are getting this change by not creating undue turbulence. And your last slide on the learnings, very important, no value judgments, and partnerships should work on their own strengths, solving the problem versus capturing opportunities, and the business model to be truly synergistic, and social enterprise definition that you mentioned initially. So it was a very, let's say, for me, even though we are all part of higher education, most of the people out here are embracing higher education, but this is something was in education for us also. Very nice of you to give us this bit of your experience and your knowledge. And I'm glad that we were all there.
Yeah, thank you, Atulji. Ramaya, has been a wonderful session. And I think there are very few likes of you who leave lucrative corporate life and get into this mission of educating educators. And I think the taste of the pudding lies in the eating. Tulji, you would agree with me, with just 22 participants in this webinar shows how much of regard we have for education. Okay, and you compare this with something on employee engagement or all those big jargons. But nevertheless, this has been a wonderful session, and I'm glad that in this bipolar world, Ramaya has taken a very balanced view about the NEP. I heard one of our very distinguished academicians in Bengal smelling America in NEP. Okay, and in that way, I really appreciate your very balanced view. It's been indeed great learning. And I think your very mission as I said, coming out of a very lucrative career in McKinsey, and with degrees from the top institutions of the country. It's really salute your great work. Harbhajan ji, you've been as wonderful, okay, and with all your humor, and thank you very much for keeping us engaged with your wonderful style. And I think more I see this gentleman, Atul, yet I've never had the experience of meeting him before. I wish I did. Okay, I get enchanted. Okay, and perhaps if he was the other side of the gender, things could have been very challenging. It's really wonderful the way you summarize and the way you proceed with things. Thank you very much. It's been really wonderful, and thank you for the opportunity to render the vote of thanks.
Thank you, everyone, and have a good weekend, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.